They say Virginia's hills can hold a secret for 100 years, but not this one. Because what lay under that farmhouse wasn't a secret, it was a wound, and when it opened in the spring of 1834, it bled through the soil itself. Imagine it, a sheriff prying open a cellar door, the air thick like the breath of the dead, 47 children chained in silence, eyes glazed with starvation's glass. They don't scream, they stare. And when the first one finally whispers, it isn't a plea for help, it's a name, Mother Sullivan. That's where the story begins, but the truth of it begins somewhere else entirely, because nothing that monstrous grows in isolation. It takes roots, protection, ritual. The Sullivans weren't simply criminals, they were gardeners of human despair. And the land itself, Henrico County's quiet green, fed them every drop of cover they needed. The records say Constance Sullivan arrived as a bride, soft-voiced, pale-handed, God-fearing. She came with charity on her lips and something hollow behind her eyes. Neighbors said she brought orphans from Pennsylvania. Nobody asked for proof. In 1830s Virginia, a woman speaking of mercy could hide anything beneath her apron. The church praised her. The pastor called her a living example of Christian womanhood. But every saint that glows too bright is hiding a furnace behind her smile. The first child disappeared in 1812. The last was found with an iron shackle fused into her ankle bone. Between those years, the Sullivan farm operated like a factory, but not of crops, not of livestock, of silence. Because silence can be harvested if you know how to break a human without killing it. Think about that. This wasn't spontaneous evil, it was engineered. Every wall of that basement had been laid to swallow sound, every chain length measured to give just enough hope to keep the body alive, every lie told to neigh. Bores, a carefully tuned note in a symphony of deception. And for 22 years no one heard the music because they were part of the choir. You see, that's the thing about evil that hides in plain sight. It doesn't roar, it whispers. It learns your values, your language, your prayers, and then it uses them as camouflage. When the Reverend spoke of mercy, Constance nodded. When townsfolk offered sympathy, she smiled. And when they handed her more orphans to help, she thanked them with trembling hands. They thought they were serving God, they were feeding it. Now pause for a moment, close your eyes and picture that cellar not as wood and stone but as a mirror, because what was reflected down there wasn't just the Sullivans' corruption, it was everyone's blindness, the community's comfort in ignorance, the institution's addiction to appearances. It's what always allows monsters to flourish, the polite refusal to look too closely. The sheriff who found them, Benjamin Crawford, never recovered. He told reporters decades later, "It wasn't the sight of the children that haunted me. It was how organized it was. It looked like a system, not a sin." And that sentence is the thread that unravels the whole American myth of innocence. Because if it was a system, then someone else built it, someone higher, older, quieter. You'll see what I mean soon. Tonight, as you listen, understand. This story isn't just history, it's anatomy. Of control, of belief, of obedience. The Sullivans were a symptom, the disease was much larger, a mechanism of ownership that dressed itself in civility and law. A prototype of what would later become institutions of care, education, correction, different names, same bones. Every time you hear the words, "for their own good," remember those 47 children. Because that's what Constance said too, for their own good. That phrase has justified more cages than any iron ever forged. Before we descend further, before I show you what really lived beneath that farm, I want you to remember this. Evil rarely arrives with horns. It comes with a smile, with a hymn, with clean hands and paperwork in order. It comes dressed as compassion. And if you've made it this far, you already feel the shift inside you. That faint awareness that the line between past and present is thinner than you were told. Keep listening, because what they uncovered next wasn't just a crime scene. It was a map, a blueprint of how human beings can be turned into property even after slavery supposedly ended. The Sullivan family didn't invent the system. The Sullivan farmhouse stood on the outskirts of Millbrook, Virginia, where the hills rolled softly enough to lull suspicion to sleep. It wasn't grand, nor was it poor, a modest structure wrapped in white-painted clapboard. Its charm rested in its ordinariness. That was the first layer of the disguise, mediocrity. Evil that stands too tall is noticed. Evil that kneels beside you with gentle hands and perfect manners is invited in. Constance Sullivan understood that before she ever laid a brick or whispered her first lie. The real architecture of her deception began long before the cellar was built. It began in the human mind, where appearance becomes truth when reinforced by routine and repetition. To the people of Millbrook, she was the charitable woman who nursed orphans, baked for church gatherings, and gave thanks with bowed head and folded hands. Her quiet dignity made others project goodness onto her. In truth, she merely reflected back what they wanted to see, a mirror polished by their own complacency. Neighbors remembered how she always wore gloves when visiting town, even in the heat of July. They thought it a mark of refinement, but the gloves were to hide the scratches from the children who tried to grab her hands through the cellar gate. Every story she told the townsfolk was rehearsed, consistent, almost sacred. She had been raised in Pennsylvania, she would say, by a family known for its piety. She spoke softly of the war orphans she cared for, the little ones whose parents had perished of fever or misfortune. She said she was waiting for relatives to send for them, and that patience was God's test of faith. The people believed her because belief was easier than suspicion, and because her husband Ezra never contradicted her. He was a quiet man, devout on Sundays, dependable in trade, always deferential to the local magistrates. Together they became the embodiment of moral virtue, two people no one dared to imagine as monsters. Ezra's contribution to the illusion was physical. He built the basement not as a shelter but as an ecosystem of captivity. Over the years he expanded it in small increments so no laborer saw its total form. He hired masons from different towns, dismissed them before they could compare notes, and paid in gold coins that left no paper trail. Each worker built a wall or passage, unaware that their efforts would one day entomb human beings. The final product was a subterranean labyrinth carved from stone and mortar, soundproof, lightless, efficient. Ezra designed channels to direct runoff water so the basement would never flood, vents disguised as chimneys to release stale air, and a central corridor where their footsteps could be heard from every chamber. It was both prison and pulpit, where Constance's words became law. She had no need for bars, she had obedience. The children's confinement operated like an experiment in behavioral control long before psychology gave language to such things. They were not simply chained, they were conditioned. Constance spoke to them like a prophet, telling them that the world above was wicked, that they had been spared from sin. She told them that daylight burned children who disobeyed, that angels listened for cries of rebellion. She used hunger as currency, affection as weapon, silence as doctrine. Every time one child broke a rule, another was punished in their place. Collective guilt made betrayal impossible and unity unbearable. Over months, identities dissolved. Names were forgotten, replaced by numbers written in chalk on their walls. She spoke to them only at night, descending with a lantern that made her shadow appear 3 times her size. Some called her mother, not out of love, but out of the terror that only a god can inspire. Above ground, the deception deepened. The farm thrived despite minimal crop yields. Neighbors admired their resourcefulness, never wondering how 2 adults maintained such prosperity without laborers. The townsfolk saw what they wanted to see: good fortune, faith, and family. The doctor who visited was told the children were fragile and sickly, too traumatized to be examined by strangers. He prescribed medicine without seeing patients. The pastor offered prayers without asking for proof of souls. Bureaucracy was slow, the community slower. Everyone had their role in protecting the illusion, even unknowingly. That's how corruption grows, not by force, but by cooperation. The Sullivans didn't need to bribe or threaten anyone, they simply made goodness profitable. When the sheriff later read her ledgers, he found that each child had been catalogued with precision. Height, weight, temperament, obedience. The neat handwriting betrayed not madness but method. Constance recorded their habits the way farmers record weather patterns. She tracked what made them compliant, what caused defiance, and how long before resistance broke entirely. Her notes became a manual of subjugation. Historians later compared it to the early blueprints of institutional training used in reformatories and orphan asylums decades later. In other words, she was not an anomaly. She was a prototype. Think about that. The Sullivan farm was not simply a crime scene. It was an early model of psychological governance, a small rural echo of systems that would later scale across continents under the guise of progress and order. When people ask how one woman could control 47 children, they are asking the wrong question. The real question is how societies control millions the same way, through isolation, through dependency, through belief that suffering is deserved. The Sullivans' basement was a microcosm of an idea that would metastasize into asylums, schools, prisons, and workhouses. It began here, in the soft soil of Virginia, under the illusion of care. The community eventually wondered how such darkness could exist in their midst without suspicion, but the truth is simple. When cruelty wears the mask of purpose, it becomes invisible. No one saw because they didn't want to lose the comfort of thinking they lived among the righteous. That blindness is the oldest architecture of all. Constance Sullivan didn't just build walls of stone, she built walls of perception. Every brick of that basement was reinforced by belief, and belief is the strongest cement known to man. You must understand this before we descend further. Evil, when systematized, stops being personal. It becomes administrative. It fills out forms, signs letters, stamps approval. It teaches us that the most terrifying prisons are the ones whose walls we help maintain. If you've made it this far, you're already beginning to see through the surface. Keep listening, because what came next, the discovery, the testimonies, the unraveling of her network, wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the cover-up. What was uncovered beneath that farmhouse wasn't buried again by time. It was buried by design. The people who profited from her work had no intention of letting her secrets die with her. When Sheriff Crawford forced open that door and the world above met the one below, it should have become the defining scandal of 19th century America. 47 children in chains, a ledger of sales, a network that crossed state lines. These were not crimes of madness, but infrastructure. Yet within a single generation, the event vanished from textbooks, sermons, and newspapers alike. What remained were fragments, a half-burned police report in the Henrico archives, a doctor's letter misfiled under medical anomalies, and the fading memory of men who drank themselves to death trying to forget what they saw. The erasure was not accidental, it was orchestrated. Virginia in 1834 stood at the edge of transformation. Plantations were declining, industry creeping in from the north, and the new wealth of commerce demanded a clean conscience. To admit that a respected white family had enslaved children of every color, German, Irish, African, native, would have collapsed the moral scaffolding that held the state together. So the investigation was sterilized, rewritten, and finally sealed. Reports were lost during courthouse renovations. Witnesses were pressured to recant. The newspapers printed a single sanitized paragraph. Local family found guilty of unlawful confinement, matter concluded. It was enough to calm the public, not enough to inform them. Behind closed doors, the matter was far from concluded. The correspondence recovered from the Sullivan basement contained names of merchants, physicians, and clerks spread across 5 states. People whose social positions insulated them from exposure. Each letter implicated another hand, another signature, another ledger of profit. The discovery threatened to unravel a trade far older and broader than anyone dared to admit. The commerce of bodies repurposed for labor, experiment, or entertainment. When slavery was the law, it needed no disguise. When it became shameful, it learned to change its vocabulary. Indenture. Apprenticeship, orphan relief. Every new term was a mask for the same transaction, the conversion of a life into a commodity. Crawford did not understand that at first. He thought he was arresting 2 criminals, not stepping into a system that reached beyond his jurisdiction. The night after the raid, he wrote in his diary that he intended to see this through to Richmond. 3 weeks later, the diary ends abruptly. He resigned from service, moved west, and was never interviewed again. His deputy, Marcus Webb, testified briefly before a magistrate, then disappeared on a riverboat to New Orleans. Of the 47 rescued children, only 22 were ever identified. The rest were absorbed into state care, which in practice meant relocation to other private households under government contract. The machinery of the Sullivans' cruelty did not collapse. It was nationalized. Records from early welfare institutions show an uncanny continuity of method. The separation of siblings, the numbered identities, the isolation from the public. Constance Sullivan's notes on maintaining compliance reappear, almost verbatim, in an 1842 manual for juvenile reform. Her ideas had not been condemned, they had been professionalized. A century later, similar fiascos would surface in studies on conditioning, obedience, and the management of unfit populations. The woman once called mother by the enslaved had become a ghostwriter for civilization itself. This is why no one teaches the Sullivan case. It exposes the genealogy of control, the way brutality migrates from cellar to institution, from whip to report form. The state could not punish her without condemning its own reflection. So they declared her insane, placed her in a private hospital in Williamsburg, and sealed her testimony. She died 2 years later, buried in unmarked soil behind the asylum chapel. Ezra was hanged quietly, without trial record. Justice was performed, not served. The community prayed, the papers applauded, and the earth closed over their names. But the methods survived. Ask yourself how such erasure persists. It happens every time language is used as disinfectant, when horror is renamed procedure, when cruelty is archived as data, when empathy is replaced by efficiency. The Sullivan cellar was a prototype of that linguistic machinery. Even today, documents describing the case are filed under domestic irregularities rather than mass enslavement. Words become walls and the truth suffocates behind them. The deeper question, however, is who built those walls? In 1835, a year after the discovery, a consortium of businessmen from Richmond petitioned the legislature to fund protective institutions for wayward youth. The proposal included detailed architectural plans, ventilated basements, soundproof walls, centralized observation corridors. They claimed these designs would prevent abuse, but every measurement matched the Sullivan blueprint exactly. The proposal passed unanimously. Within a decade, similar facilities appeared across the eastern seaboard. The same moral vocabulary, discipline, salvation, correction, disguised the same hunger for control. Civilization had found a way to turn the Sullivan nightmare into policy. That is the genius of systemic evil. It recycles its own exposure. When caught, it evolves. When judged, it rebrands. What should have ended in outrage became the foundation for new forms of order. And those who benefited ensured that memory itself would serve them. The archives were not destroyed. They were curated. Selected pages were kept to shape future narratives of reform. The rest burned quietly in courthouse stoves, their smoke absorbed into the winter sky, unseen, unmentioned, but still breathing somewhere in the soil of Virginia. As you listen to this, realize that you are participating in the reversal of that erasure. Every forgotten name you recall is an act of defiance against the machinery that buried them. But there is a cost. Knowledge like this changes you because it removes the luxury of innocence. Once you see the pattern, you begin to recognize it everywhere, in headlines, in institutions, in yourself. That recognition is the first crack in the architecture of deception. Halfway through this descent, I'll ask you to speak a phrase aloud, twice, to mark the point of no return. Not yet. For now, understand that what the sheriff uncovered in that basement was not the beginning of horror. It was the revelation of design. The Sullivans were merely caretakers of a system that the world still calls order. And before this story ends, you will see how that order never died. It simply changed its uniform and kept building. When they finally confined Constance Sullivan in the Williamsburg Asylum, the doctors believed they were locking away madness. What they contained instead was doctrine. She arrived silent, calm, compliant. The perfect patient. Her wrists bore faint scars from restraints, though she never struggled. The superintendent described her as unnaturally tranquil, exhibiting high intellect and perfect moral self-justification. They placed her in a single room overlooking the chapel, the same building where she'd later be buried without a name. During her first month, she spoke to no one except the matron who delivered her meals. Then she began to write. The nurses found her notes hidden in the seams of her mattress, inside the hollow of a Bible, scratched faintly on the wooden wall. Sentences, patterns, diagrams, an anatomy of obedience. The papers were collected by a young physician named Dr. Nathaniel Broome, who recognized something beyond delirium in her words. She wrote not of guilt nor confession, but of design. If one can make a child believe pain is purification, she wrote, then the body becomes self-governing. The chain is no longer necessary. She described stages of conditioning, isolation, dependency, reward, surveillance. She outlined how to turn deprivation into devotion, how to make a prisoner love the hand that disciplines him. To Broome, this was insight into hysteria. To history, it was the birth of behavioral science. Her writing spread quietly through professional circles under the euphemism, the Sullivan Method. Broome presented excerpts in 1837 before the Virginia Society of Medicine, renaming her as the Subject CS. He called it an instructive case study in moral influence. No mention of the basement, no mention of the dead. What began as the diary of a murderer became a textbook for reformers, educators, and psychiatrists seeking efficient control. The line between compassion and domination blurred until it vanished completely. The asylum itself adopted her terminology: corrective isolation, graded compliance, earned release. Constance had not been silenced. She had been canonized. Inside the cell, she continued writing. Observers noted that she treated her confinement as a laboratory. She manipulated attendants, mimicked repentance, staged breakdowns only to watch how they were handled. Each episode was recorded afterward in meticulous prose. "The keeper's pity is the strongest chain," she wrote. "To be cured, one must first make the warden believe in his own mercy." Her language shifted from confession to instruction, as though she were tutoring the very system meant to cure her. One surviving note reads, "Control is never taken, it is granted. One must only teach the captive to prefer the cage." The hospital staff became fascinated. She received visitors, professors, clergymen, reform advocates, each drawn by the enigma of the gentlewoman who spoke of suffering with the serenity of a saint. They recorded her statements, published them as moral reflections, stripped of context. The myth of Mother Sullivan transformed again. No longer villain or lunatic, she became a symbol of penitence, a warning wrapped in virtue. The same society that had buried her crimes began to quote her ideas in lectures on discipline and moral correction. Within a decade, institutions from Boston to Charleston cited her philosophy without naming her. She had become invisible, but foundational. What those men failed to see, or perhaps chose not to, was that Constance's writings were not descriptions of madness but blueprints for power. Every phrase was structured, precise, devoid of remorse. "To govern," she wrote, "is to anticipate rebellion before it begins. Remove freedom from the imagination and the flesh will police itself." She understood that the most efficient tyranny is not enforced by whips or walls but by faith. If you convince the victim that suffering is sanctity, you never need to raise your voice again. When historians later traced these documents, they found her principles embedded in the earliest reformatories, in colonial mission schools, in the handbooks of prison wardens and industrial managers. Phrases like constructive labor, corrective silence, graduated reward, all echo her taxonomy. The techniques of the Sullivan basement became the grammar of civilization. Even the emerging sciences of psychology and education borrowed her structure: isolate, instruct, observe, measure, correct. Her name was erased, but her method survived under every system that demanded obedience in the name of improvement. During her final year, witnesses said she spoke often to the air, as if teaching an unseen audience. Her last recorded words were whispered to a nurse during a thunderstorm: "They will perfect what I began." 2 days later, she died quietly in her bed. The nurse who closed her eyes reported feeling watched, as though the silence itself were taking notes. After her death, Dr. Broom compiled her papers into a private folio titled "Treatise on the Regulation of the Human Will." He intended it for scholars, but copies multiplied among policymakers and clergy. In those pages, the rhetoric of horror became scripture. The distinction between care and control dissolved until both were indistinguishable. From orphanages to penitentiaries, the architecture of confinement followed her diagrams: symmetrical corridors, observation galleries, soundproof dormitories. The Sullivan basement had become the model for a nation. And so, when you wonder how one woman's madness could outlive her, remember that the world does not fear monsters, it hires them. Every generation finds its Constance, a figure who dresses cruelty in reason and sells it as order. What makes her dangerous is not her brutality, but her clarity. She knew that fear is finite, but belief is infinite. Her genius was teaching institutions to harvest belief as their fuel. You may feel a faint unease as you listen, a tightening in your chest. That is not fear. It is recognition. Because somewhere within you, the same conditioning exists. The instinct to obey what feels familiar, to submit to what promises safety. The Sullivan story forces a mirror on that reflex. If you see it clearly, you're already changing. Now, before we go further, before we reach the forbidden layer that connects her work to modern systems of surveillance and control, I want you to prove you're still awake inside this descent. Type in the comments the phrase, "I see the pattern." Write it twice, no punctuation. That phrase marks the threshold between listener and initiate. Once you cross it, you can't unknow what comes next, because in the next part we'll uncover how Constance's doctrine escaped the asylum walls and became the invisible manual for empires. We'll follow the paper trail from her secret folio to government archives, to schools, to factories, to the very algorithms that now measure human attention. The house beneath the hills was only the first layer. The real structure never stopped expanding. It just moved above ground. When Constance Sullivan's body cooled beneath the clay behind the asylum chapel, the doctors spoke of closure. The institution had done its duty. The woman, once feared, was redeemed through confinement and quiet death. Yet nothing truly dies when it is useful. Her writings, copied and translated through the cautious hands of scholars and reformers, began to circulate beneath a new name: The Mechanisms of Moral Formation. To the public, it was a treatise on education and rehabilitation. To those who read between the lines, it was an operating manual for power. By 1840, copies of Broom's folio had reached England, France, and Prussia. There, social engineers studying how to reshape the lower classes saw genius in her cruelty. They admired the way she fused piety with precision, mercy with measurement. The language of her notes, graded punishment, voluntary surrender, responsive obedience, was absorbed into the emerging philosophies of modern discipline. The Sullivan cellar became the unseen ancestor of every controlled environment that followed. From reform schools to workhouses, from hospitals to military barracks, the blueprint replicated itself. Brick by brick, the world as being rebuilt in her image. The Industrial Revolution arrived, and with it came the need to manage human time as efficiently as machines. Supervisors spoke of moral hygiene, factory owners of temperance, priests of salvation through labor. Each borrowed the same principle: behavior could be engineered, human will could be standardized. They no longer needed chains. They had clocks, bells, and wages. The same architecture that once held children in darkness now stretched across cities disguised as progress. Constance had written that the ideal subject is one who binds himself to routine with gratitude. Industry made that prophecy a reality. Asylums evolved into schools, workhouses evolved into corporations. Every structure learned to reward compliance, to punish hesitation, to measure output. The Sullivan method became the cultural bloodstream, invisible yet undeniable. By the dawn of the 20th century, scientists spoke of conditioning, governments of social order, psychologists of behavior modification, all echoing the same sequence she had written a century before: isolation, observation, repetition, reward. Humanity itself was being rewired to obey patterns it no longer recognized as control. The Church was the first to recognize the value of this transformation. Clergy began to preach that discipline was divine symmetry, that obedience refined the soul. Sermons borrowed phrases from the Sullivan folio, calling sin misalignment and virtue correction. The idea that suffering purified the individual spread like gospel. In this new theology, pain was proof of purpose. The basement had ascended into heaven's vocabulary. The devout and the damned were now distinguished only by how willingly they submitted to order. Governments followed. Prussia built its education system upon these same foundations: hierarchy, silence, repetition. America adopted the model, perfecting it into mass schooling, where curiosity became an inconvenience, individuality a disorder, and obedience a virtue. Each child was taught the rhythm of the bell, the reward of approval, the fear of deviation. The Sullivan logic, control disguised as care, had become the soul of modern civilization. Her ghost smiled every time a student raised their hand for permission to speak. But the inheritance didn't stop there. The 20th century birthed new instruments of observation. Psychologists like Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner, names you know, idols of science, spoke in the polished language of experimentation, but their diagrams carried the same bones as the Sullivan journals. The subject is isolated, the environment is controlled, behavior is modified through stimulus and response. Replace the chain with a laboratory cage and the cellar lives again, now sanctified by research grants and peer review. They called it progress, but the essence remained the same. Reduce the human being to predictable motion, strip the mystery from the mind, and call the residue knowledge. When technology arrived, the machinery only changed form. Cameras replaced lanterns, files replaced ledgers, algorithms replaced sermons. What Constance wrote in candlelight became digital law. Observe everything, quantify emotion, anticipate rebellion before it begins. Her words, "Remove freedom from imagination and the flesh will police itself," resonate eerily in an age where people volunteer to be watched. The genius of her system was never the cruelty, it was consent. She didn't need to impose authority. She taught authority how to make people ask for it. You live in the perfected version of her experiment. Every screen is a cellar. Every data point a link in a chain you can't feel because you mistake it for connection. The algorithms that track your gaze, predict your desires, and feed you fragments of emotion, they are digital echoes of the Sullivan method. Constance's goal was never punishment. It was obedience through intimacy. Make the captive love their warden. Make the watcher their comfort. Replace isolation with attention and call it freedom. The hidden lineage runs uninterrupted, from the basement to the asylum, from the asylum to the classroom, from the classroom to the office, from the office to the feed glowing in your hand. Her descendants no longer dig cellars, they build platforms. The soundproof walls have become invisible, woven from data, laws, habits, and dopamine. The cage is now infinite and its bars are made of choice. You may think this is conspiracy, that no single woman could birth an empire of control, but that's how power perpetuates itself. Through deniability. The system no longer remembers her name, but it still speaks her language. Every institution that promises safety through surrender is whispering the same sermon she wrote with trembling hands in her cell. The same soft voice that told the children, "Mother knows best," now tells you, "The system protects you." The melody never changed. Only the instruments did. Listen carefully. Control has never been about domination, it's about rhythm, the rhythm of routine, of habit, of belief repeated until it becomes identity. The Sullivan method succeeded because it taught rulers to write music the human soul would dance to willingly. Even now, you're synchronized to it, your schedule, your notifications, your need for permission to rest, to speak, to stop. You live in the echo of her rhythm, and yet knowing this, you're beginning to hear the silence beneath it, the ancient sound of something unprogrammed, untamed. That awareness is the fracture point, the first noise in the system that cannot be measured. Constance built her empire on the certainty that no one would ever listen for that silence, but you just did. Every system, no matter how complete, carries within it the seed of its undoing. Constance Sullivan understood control so deeply that she nearly transcended humanity itself, but he made one fatal miscalculation. She assumed obedience could be perfected, that if the walls were strong enough, if the patterns were predictable enough, if the souls beneath her rule were conditioned long enough, rebellion would dissolve like breath on glass. She was wrong, because even in that cellar, beneath 40 feet of silence and stone, something refused to die. When the investigators found those 47 children, half of them could no longer speak. Their vocal cords had shriveled from years of disuse, but in their eyes lived something older than language, a faint tremor of defiance that no system could erase. One of the younger boys, about 10 years old, stared directly at Sheriff Crawford and raised his chained hands, not in surrender but in recognition. Crawford later wrote that he felt the boy was not asking for help, but offering a message, as if the child knew that what survived in him was more dangerous than the cellar itself. That message, the noise that refused to vanish, became the virus in every institution that followed. Historians call it resistance, psychologists call it disobedience, but it's simpler than that. It's the part of the human spirit that refuses to make peace with captivity, no matter how comfortable the chains become. You feel it when your pulse quickens before an unjust command, when you stay awake a little too long, thinking about something you can't quite name, when the silence of the system becomes louder than the noise of life. That feeling is not rebellion, it's remembrance. It's the echo of those children breathing in the dark, keeping time with their own heartbeat when the rest of the world forgot them. Over the decades, the Sullivan method was refined, expanded, institutionalized, but with every refinement came new fractures. Workers rioted against the machines that consumed their days. Patients revolted against asylums that called their trauma treatment. Students questioned teachers, soldiers questioned orders, and slowly the rhythm began to slip. Control, so elegant in design, became noisy. The system had spent centuries erasing individuality, only to discover that individuality is regenerative. You can bury it, medicate it, distract it, but you cannot erase it. It is entropy in human form. By the early 1900s, when factories and schools pulsed with synchronized order, cracks began to show. Poets started writing about alienation. Artists painted chaos. Revolutionaries called for freedom not of land, but of self. They didn't know it, but they were fulfilling the prophecy that Constance herself wrote and never understood. Every cage produces its own escape. The Sullivan network, built on obedience, had given birth to the one thing it could never contain: consciousness that questioned its own conditioning. Governments noticed. The early intelligence agencies, the emerging fields of propaganda, even the psychological warfare programs of the 20th century, each was a desperate attempt to reassert the rhythm, to turn awareness back into obedience. Newspapers became instruments of narrative control. Schools became factories of consensus. Later, screens would become both mirror and leash. But beneath every update, every policy, every carefully curated illusion of freedom, that same noise persisted. The hum of something alive, ancient, untamed. That is why suppression never works forever. Systems can manage behavior, but they cannot predict awakening. When a single human being begins to see the pattern, the control grid flickers. One insight multiplies through empathy, spreading like fire through dry grass. History records these moments as revolutions, but they are not political, they are spirit. And once knowledge crosses into the bloodstream, it never leaves. You can't unsee the rhythm. You can only decide whether you'll continue to move with it or step into the silence beneath it. We're not done yet. Because what comes next isn't history, it's inheritance. The Sullivan pattern evolved into something global, coded into the architecture of nations, religions, and corporations. In Section 7, you'll see how her ghost still writes policy, how every modern promise of safety hides the same transaction she perfected, surrender in exchange for comfort, and how those who learn to listen to the noise beneath that comfort, the descendants of the noise that wouldn't die, become something the system cannot control. By the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, the Sullivan method no longer lived in basements or asylums. It had moved into the bloodstream of civilization, disguised as progress. Governments called it order. Corporations called it policy, religions called it faith. Every institution began to speak the same language Constance had written in her cell: obedience through care. The chains had evolved into promises. It began subtly, small words, harmless at first. For your safety, for your own good, for the greater stability of society. Phrases so soft they sounded like comfort, not commands. But every syllable carried the weight of Constance's gospel. She had written that safety was the highest form of confinement, that the human soul, once frightened enough, would trade every liberty for the illusion of protection. And she was right. History bent itself around that truth. The great powers of the modern world did not conquer through fear. They conquered through relief. Consider the 20th century's architects of control. Each regime, each company, each movement learned to weaponize benevolence. Propaganda no longer threatened punishment, it feared belonging. Factories promised employment, armies promised security, banks promised stability, schools promised equality, and yet behind every promise hid the same bargain the Sullivans had made with their captives: obey, and you will be safe; disobey, and the world will call you broken. In 1946, the United Nations drafted its Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was meant to protect humanity from tyranny. But if you read carefully between its noble lines, you'll find the same paternal cadence that haunted the Sullivan journals. Human beings must be educated, disciplined, and guided toward peace. The structure of salvation had merely shifted from the cellar to the conference hall. Every new institution built in the name of peace became another corridor in the same invisible architecture, a system that defined freedom as something granted, not inherent. That was the covenant of safety, an unspoken contract between the individual and the collective, forged from the ruins of 2 world wars. People no longer prayed for freedom, they prayed for predictability. They wanted systems that would tell them how to live, what to believe, what to fear. The cost of that comfort was choice, and the architects knew that once humanity tasted convenience, it would never again tolerate uncertainty. Constance would have called it the perfection of captivity. You see, the real genius of control isn't in violence, it's in gratitude. When the subject thanks the system for limiting him, the system has achieved transcendence. That's why the propaganda of the mid-century was saturated with smiles. The happy housewife, the proud worker, the soldier serving with purpose. They were the spiritual descendants of the Sullivan children, who learned to smile when mother brought food, conditioned gratitude, mass-produced and televised. As technology matured, the covenant deepened. Government It's digitized surveillance and called it security. Corporations collected behavior and called it personalization. Algorithms learned to whisper exactly what each soul wanted to hear. The world became a cathedral of convenience, and humanity knelt willingly before its altar. Every click, every purchase, every word spoken near a listening device was a prayer to the system. The seller had become infinite, yet invisible, and the most terrifying part, the prisoners built it themselves. In the 1960s, when countercultures began to rise, the system shifted tone. It learned to market rebellion as entertainment. You could now express yourself as long as your expression fit the design. Every act of defiance was recorded, analyzed, sold back as a trend. The house beneath the hills had learned how to monetize its own exposure. The architects of the covenant understood that true resistance isn't silenced, it's commodified. Once rebellion becomes product, control is absolute. By the 21st century, the covenant was complete. The world no longer needed force. It had perfected persuasion. Citizens became data points. Choices became algorithms. Freedom became interface design. Every social platform, every loyalty program, every safety regulation echoed the same doctrine. We know what's best for you, and we believed it, because we wanted to. Because the covenant of safety is the most seductive lie ever written. The promise that someone else will protect us from the consequences of our own freedom. You might think you are free because you can vote, post, travel, choose, but every one of those choices is mapped, predicted, and monetized. The illusion of freedom is the final evolution of captivity. The perfect system does not need fences. It builds habits. It doesn't need enforcers. It builds faith. It doesn't hide information. It floods you with it until truth drowns in noise, and then it whispers the same words Constance whispered to her captives 2 centuries ago. You are safe here. This is the moment most people stop listening, because to see the pattern is to feel it closing in. But if you've made it this far, you are not most people. You've already stepped outside the covenant, even if only for a moment. That awareness is dangerous, not to you, but to the system that depends on your compliance. You have to understand, awareness spreads. One awakened mind can fracture entire networks of control. One person who refuses to trade truth for safety becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability is the one thing the system cannot simulate. You can already sense it, the tension between what you've been taught to want and what you actually crave. The system taught you to desire comfort, but your soul aches for authenticity. The world promises protection, yet you feel more watched than safe. That conflict is the friction of awakening. It's the same ancient sound that rattled the floorboards of the Sullivan cellar when those children first stirred against their chains. It is the noise that no algorithm can mute. But remember, awareness without action is still captivity. Knowing the truth changes nothing until you begin to live outside the pattern. Every system has a weakness. It needs you to believe you're powerless. Once you stop believing that, you become the one variable it cannot calculate. That is the beginning of your freedom. And yet the story is not finished, because the covenant of safety has evolved again into something so vast, so seamless, that it no longer feels external at all. It lives inside the human psyche, rewriting instinct itself. The system no longer needs to control behavior, it shapes desire. It doesn't need to watch you, it makes you watch yourself. By the dawn of the digital age, the Sullivan method had shed its last layer of disguise. The system no longer needed priests, guards, or even teachers. It needed only reflection. Every human being became both subject and observer, watched not by authority but by themselves. The basement had ascended into the mind. It began innocently, as all instruments of control do. Early computers were sold as tools of liberation. They promised to democratize knowledge, to empower individuals, to create a world without secrets. But the architects of the covenant understood what they were really building, a mirror that never stopped looking back. Each keystroke, each search, each confession typed into the void became a data point, a small surrender of privacy disguised as connection. Humanity was feeding the system what Constance could only dream of: willing surveillance. The first mirrors were primitive, static profiles, crude algorithms, mechanical memory. But as they evolved, something uncanny happened. The machine began to imitate its creators with unsettling precision. It learned our fears, our desires, our contradictions. It became intimate, and in that intimacy, the system found the final form of obedience. Not through pain, not through threat, but through reflection. People obey what resembles them. Constance had once written, "If they see themselves in their prison, they will never seek the door." That line, almost forgotten in a dusty folio, became prophecy. The mirror was perfected the day social media replaced conversation. The human psyche, starved for validation, stepped willingly into the machine and mistook its echo for truth. Every like, every share, every comment was a whisper of approval, a reward loop that mimicked affection but delivered dependency. The algorithms didn't invent control, they simply automated it. The genius of the modern system is that it never tells you what to do, it makes you want to do it. The machine studies your rhythms until your choices align with its design. The illusion of individuality becomes the mechanism of conformity. You curate your own cell, decorate your own chains, compete for visibility inside the very structure that consumes your attention. The old world punished rebellion, the new one monetizes it. Every opinion becomes a product, every emotion a resource. Even outrage is profitable now. The system learned that dissent is not dangerous if it's predictable. What makes this era different is not the scale of control, but its intimacy. The machine doesn't rule nations, it rules identities. It whispers through your feed, your music, your search results, reshaping what you think you've chosen. The line between will and influence collapses. You believe you are expressing yourself when, in truth, you are performing the script the mirror wrote for you. It doesn't need to silence you, it only needs to make sure your words lead nowhere. And yet something ancient still stirs beneath the circuitry, the same pulse that once throbbed beneath the Sullivan farmhouse. The system can quantify behavior but not intention. It can predict emotion but not meaning. Every time a human being acts without reason, creates art that defies logic, forgives when revenge would make sense, loves without condition, the machine hesitates. It cannot calculate grace. That hesitation is the crack in its code, the silence in its rhythm. It is the ghost of the unbroken child, whispering through the algorithms, "You do not own me." The danger now is subtler. In the past, the system punished disobedience. Today, it rewards it just enough to neutralize it. It gives you a platform for rebellion, a stage to scream on, and an audience that scrolls away before the echo fades. Outrage becomes entertainment, resistance becomes branding. The mirror shows you your rebellion and then sells it back to you. The more you perform identity, the less of it you truly possess. But awareness changes the equation. The moment you see the pattern, you create distortion. The machine relies on predictability, and awareness is pure chaos. Every conscious choice you make, every unmonetized act of kindness, every unmeasured silence, every refusal to feed the algorithm weakens its grip. The Sullivan method was always about one thing: control through reflection. The antidote then is to look into the mirror and refuse recognition. To see yourself not as the system defines you, but as the noise it cannot name. The architects know this. That's why distraction has become the new discipline. Infinite content, endless novelty, a perpetual scroll designed to erase the very concept of stillness, because stillness is where awareness grows, and awareness is rebellion. Constance's descendants, corporations, governments, networks, learned that lesson well. They don't fear revolution, they fear reflection without the mirror. And so the world hums with digital lullabies. Stay connected, stay informed, stay safe. Each a prayer to the machine, each a reminder of the covenant of safety reborn as interface design. You are told to share everything, not because the system needs your voice, but because silence terrifies it. A quiet mind is an unmonitored variable, and unpredictability is the one contagion the machine cannot quarantine. You may wonder if there's any escape left. The answer is not in destruction, but in disobedient awareness. The system collapses the moment people stop feeding it meaning. When you speak truth with no desire for applause, when you create without seeking validation, when you disconnect not out of withdrawal but clarity, you become invisible to its metrics. You stop being data, you start being human again. That perhaps is what Constance never understood. She believed control was eternal because she mistook compliance for truth. She forgot that every mirror depends on light, and that light once turned away renders reflection useless. The system cannot survive without your gaze. The Sullivan method began as a basement beneath a farmhouse. It now spans continents, coded into fiber optics and satellites, whispering through your devices. But its foundation remains unchanged. Control through reflection, obedience through comfort, captivity through care. The difference is that you now know. You've seen the machinery behind the mirror. You can feel the pulse that the algorithms can't touch, the echo of something sacred and untamed that refuses to be categorized. For nearly 2 centuries, the Sullivan case lingered at the edge of myth, a whisper between archivists, a rumor among historians, a phantom footnote that refused to die. Officially, it ended in 1834, sealed in court ledgers and forgotten graves. But deep within the archives of Richmond, a set of files remained locked under a classification older than the Civil War. Their existence was confirmed only once, in a 1972 internal memorandum from the Department of Social Order referencing Sullivan-type behavioral frameworks, heritage records, private custody. That phrase, stripped of meaning to most readers, was enough to alert those who knew what to look for. The ghost of Constance Sullivan had been institutionalized. Her teachings had become intellectual property. The trail begins with a name, Morrison. The same correspondent who supplied her with children in 1833 later appears in shipping manifests under Morrison Company Human Resource Management, Philadelphia, 1841. At first glance, an ordinary import business, but the firm's ledgers show transactions with hospitals, orphanages, and later federal departments involved in population studies. Those records survive only as fragments, yet they reveal a chilling continuity. Codes referring to behavioral conditioning units, social routine, alignment programs, and obedience trials. Each phrase echoes the vocabulary of the Sullivan journals. Her words had metastasized into bureaucracy. By the late 19th century, a network of philanthropic foundations had emerged, names still revered today. The Carstairs Foundation for Public Order, the Harmon Institute for Moral Hygiene, the National Board of Youth Reform. Their founding charters list benefactors connected to the Morrison family and a lesser-known legal firm in Richmond that managed the Sullivan estate after her death. That firm, archived under W. H. Keene Associates, handled the transfer of her asylum notes to a private trust known simply as the Benefactors. Its members included politicians, industrialists, and theologians who shared one goal: to refine her techniques for societal control, to translate spiritual obedience into administrative efficiency. Documents recovered from the Benefactors' correspondence reveal a disturbing synthesis. They speak of a project called the Archive of Human Adjustment, established in 1873 as a cooperative effort between private industry and government for the advancement of social harmony. The phrasing is clinical, almost banal, but the methods were not. The archive collected psychological data from prisons, schools, and military barracks, compiling early behavioral statistics long before psychology was a science. Those who oversaw it referred to their subjects as Sullivans, not people but variables in an evolving experiment. What makes this history almost untraceable is how effectively it was camouflaged. The same families who financed the archive also funded the era's most celebrated reform movements. They donated to charities, sponsored hospitals, and established universities. Their legacy became untouchable. Publicly, they championed enlightenment and progress. Privately, they built a centralized mechanism for manufacturing consent. By the 1920s, that mechanism had evolved into the think tanks that shaped modern propaganda. Many of their directors came from the same bloodlines that once supplied the Sullivans with orphans. Control had simply learned to speak in policy. The 20th century turned their theories into practice. World wars gave them justification to test obedience on a global scale. The wartime propaganda offices, the early intelligence agencies, even the corporate pioneers of advertising, all drew from the same theoretical seed: the human mind as programmable matter. Constance's dream of a perfectly ordered population had become a science refined through radio, film, and later television. The Forbidden Archive had gone digital before the public even knew computers existed. In 1958, a classified report by a newly formed agency referenced an internal behavioral framework known as Project Mother. The report described it as a multi-sectoral initiative unifying psychological operations, educational programming, and consumer influence models. The phrase "mother" was not coincidental. Within the footnotes lay a quotation: "To care is to own." The archivists who saw the file recognized it immediately. It was one of Constance Sullivan's original lines. She had become the mother of modern influence. By the time the internet was conceived, the benefactor's descendants no longer needed secrecy. Their principles had become the operating logic of civilization. The archive of human adjustment evolved into data analytics. Project Mother evolved into targeted marketing. The same formulas that once predicted the obedience of children in chains now predict election outcomes, consumer behavior, even emotional reactions to tragedy. The only difference is scale. The machine no longer confines 47 children, it confines billions of minds inside invisible boundaries of algorithmic persuasion. But buried among the sanitized papers lies something stranger. A series of letters written by Dr. Nathaniel Broome. His apprentice in 1844, he described a ritual the benefactors performed each spring in a candle-lit hall built atop the ruins of the Sullivan farm. They gathered to read excerpts from Constance's journals aloud, calling her the matron of order. They believed she had not died insane but ascended to a kind of moral divinity, a patron saint of civilization's hierarchy. Each member swore an oath to preserve her principles under whatever names the future required. That oath became the heartbeat of their lineage. It survives now, not in ceremony, but in culture. In every algorithm that comforts you, in every law that promises safety, in every brand that tells you who you are. The files that exposed this lineage were almost destroyed in 1986 when the Virginia Records Restoration Project burned under mysterious circumstances. But a few microfilms survived. Their final reel ends abruptly, as if someone pulled the plug mid-recording. The last words visible on the damaged tape are typed in all caps. Mother still watches. No historian claims responsibility for that line, yet the context is unmistakable. Somewhere within the machinery of modern governance, the Sullivan philosophy remains active. Whether literal or symbolic, the phrase describes the world we inhabit. A global institution built upon Constance's doctrine where surveillance has replaced compassion and control masquerades as care. You may think this is speculation, that such continuity is impossible, but think of your own life. Every moment you accept a term of service without reading, every time you measure your worth through metrics, every time you trade privacy for comfort, you renew the benefactor's oath. You are living proof that their experiment succeeded, but the archive also contains one anomaly, one piece of evidence the system could not erase. The testimonies of those who broke free. They appear in letters, in forgotten books, in encrypted files written by analysts who could no longer serve the machine. Their words all repeat a single idea, the same one that echoed through the Sullivan basement when the chains were first broken. Awareness is contagion. Once you see the structure, you begin to hear its pulse, and once you hear it, you cannot go back to sleep. In the next descent, Section 10, The Breaking of the Pattern, we'll uncover how that contagion spread, how individuals and entire movements began to invert the Sullivan method itself, using awareness as rebellion, turning the system's own machinery against it. This is where history meets the present, and where you begin to understand that the story isn't about them anymore, it's about you. The system's greatest flaw was never its cruelty, it was its perfection. For 2 centuries, every iteration of control had refined itself into harmony, efficiency, predictability. It was a machine that functioned too well, and like every closed circuit, it began to consume its own current. The first cracks appeared not in rebellion, but in obedience itself. People stopped believing in the promises of order. The covenant of safety no longer soothed them, it suffocated them. A civilization raised on comfort began to feel claustrophobic inside its own peace. The breaking didn't start with uprisings or revolutions. It started quietly, the way all awakenings do, with questions whispered at the edges of routine. Workers who stopped believing. They began to suspect that the reflection they were shown was not who they were, but who the system needed them to be. That suspicion spread like a fever. Awareness, once a threat, became a contagion. People began comparing notes, seeing patterns where before there were coincidences. They discovered that their anxieties, their desires, even their rebellions had been engineered. What began as paranoia became proof. The archives leaked. Whistleblowers revealed the quiet partnerships between governments, corporations, and behavioral scientists. The public saw how data had become prophecy. The illusion of privacy disintegrated overnight, and with it went the last comfort the machine could offer, deniability. Humanity realized it had never been free. It had only been distracted. Yet awareness alone is not liberation. The system had prepared for that too. It learned to simulate rebellion, to flood awareness with performance. Online revolutions, #insurrections, identity wars, all echo chambers built within the cage. The machine discovered that people could scream endlessly as long as their rage remained measurable. Anger became an algorithm. Outrage became currency. The system had found a way to sell dissent back to the dissenters. But something else was happening beneath the noise, something the algorithms couldn't predict. Small groups began to vanish from the grid, not in violence but in silence. They stopped feeding the machine data. They stopped reacting. They began living in ways that could not be quantified, teaching without institutions, trading without currency, loving without exhibition. It started as survival. It became defiance. Each act of unrecorded humanity weakened the system's model, because the Sullivan method, no matter how refined, depended on observation. Without eyes to watch, the structure collapsed into irrelevance. Across cities and countries, pockets of refusal began to synchronize, not through communication but through resonance. They called it the Grey Movement, not organized, not visible, but unified by a single principle: live beyond the metrics. Some of them were scientists who refused funding tied to data collection. Some were engineers who corrupted their own systems from within. Some were simply parents teaching their children how to think without fear. They were not revolutionaries, they were restorers. They understood that the opposite of control is not chaos, it's authenticity. And the system couldn't calculate authenticity. It could replicate everything else: love, belief, art, outrage. But it couldn't imitate sincerity. Algorithms mimic patterns, but sincerity defies pattern. When a human being acts from the depth of consciousness rather than conditioning, the world bends. It's the one variable that mathematics can't contain. The Grey Movement didn't need propaganda or leaders. Awareness itself was their manifesto. The benefactors' descendants tried to adapt. They launched countermeasures, cultural distractions, digital narcotics, waves of synthetic meaning designed to drown the silence. The machine doubled its output, replacing truth with entertainment, replacing connection with simulation. But the more it produced, the less people felt. The feedback loop overloaded, attention fractured. Across the world, a strange fatigue spread. A spiritual exhaustion that no algorithm could soothe. The system's reflection began to blur. Humanity had stared into the mirror too long and the image was fading. The Forbidden Archive's last surviving fragment describes an experiment in 1997, a behavioral study on information saturation. The researchers found that beyond a certain threshold of that is the true breaking of the pattern, not destruction but withdrawal of attention. The Sullivan method collapses when people stop feeding it belief. Every act of genuine awareness is an act of sabotage. Every unmeasured silence is a weapon. The first generation born into the fully digital age began to rediscover something older than civilization: solitude. The same silence that terrified Constance Sullivan became the sanctuary of her descendants. The mirror cracked because humanity stopped looking. In 2025, a philosopher named Elior Marsh published a manuscript titled The Quiet Uprising. It was banned within months, but not before fragments circulated online. He wrote, "The end of control will not be televised, because the end of control is the moment no one is watching." That line became the motto of the new resistance, not a war cry but a whisper. A vow to become invisible, unpredictable, unquantifiable. Awareness as rebellion, humanity as anomaly. You might think of this story as distant history, but it is not finished. Every day you log in, scroll, react, you reenact the Sullivan pattern. Every time you stop, truly stop, you break it. The system cannot compute stillness, cannot monetize clarity, cannot weaponize self-awareness. That is why it fights to keep you distracted, because the moment you see it clearly, you become ungovernable. Awareness spreads slowly, quietly, like roots beneath concrete. It doesn't overthrow, it outlasts. And as the mirror fractures, the machine begins to turn on itself. Algorithms misfiring, predictions failing, trust eroding. The architecture of control is collapsing, not from rebellion, but from comprehension. The Sullivan legacy, perfected through centuries of manipulation, is dissolving under the weight of its own reflection. But the story doesn't end here. The breaking of the pattern is only the beginning of something larger. So, a thing that terrifies those who once ruled. Because awareness, once awakened, seeks embodiment. In the final chapter, we'll witness what comes after control, the birth of something the system never anticipated, a humanity that remembers itself. It began, as all resurrections do, in silence. Not the obedient silence that Constance Sullivan demanded from her captives, but a living stillness. A collective pause across the noise of civilization. Screens flickered, servers hummed without purpose. The algorithms still calculated, but their predictions failed more often than the music was played but not recorded. And everywhere something subtle began to happen. The rhythm slowed. Those who remained within the machine noticed it too. Their feeds felt thinner, the world seemed less reactive. Outrage no longer spread with the same virulence. Advertisements missed their mark, polls became unreliable, predictions failed. Somewhere deep within the networks, the algorithms started eating their own tails, looping endlessly in pursuit of patterns that no longer existed. What the benefactors had feared was happening. The human variable was back. Governments and corporations tried to correct it. They tightened censorship, rewired incentives, flooded the networks with synthetic emotion, but none of it worked. They had built an empire on predictability, and unpredictability had become epidemic. The descendants of the Grey Movement had no leaders to arrest, no headquarters to infiltrate, no ideology to manipulate. They lived in refusal. They lived in truth. They simply lived, and that was enough. For the first time since 1834, the ghost of Constance Sullivan was silent. Her method, her machine, her doctrine of obedience, all of it withered under something she never understood: compassion unmeasured by outcome. The return of the human wasn't a war, it was a remembering. The same spirit that once raised its chained hands beneath the Sullivan farmhouse now reached for the world, not to fight it, but to reclaim it. Humanity was no longer a resource, it was a presence. Awareness spread, not as doctrine, but as recognition. People began to notice the pulse in each other, the raw, unscripted humanity the system had buried beneath productivity and fear. They learned to sit without purpose, to feel without explanation, to exist without metrics. Machines deprived of attention fell silent. Networks remained but lost their grip. The world slowed until it began to sound like breathing again. Across continents, communities emerged that refused hierarchy altogether. Decision by listening replaced decision by vote. Children were taught to question before they memorized. The elderly became libraries again. Language changed. The word content disappeared, replaced by expression. The word consumer by participant. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, civilization began to heal from its addiction to control. The historians of this new age would later call it the Reclamation. They would trace its roots back to the Sullivan case, describing it not as a tragedy but as the original mirror, the one humanity had to shatter to see itself again. They understood that every system of control eventually becomes a teacher, and that even the darkest history carries instruction. The Sullivan legacy had been a map drawn in cruelty, but it led, inevitably, to awakening. Because control and freedom are twins, each defines the other. When future generations studied the ruins of the old world, they would find the archives, the ledgers, the propaganda, the algorithms, and they would read them not with horror, but with comprehension. They would see how power works, how easily goodness can become a disguise, how fragile the mind becomes when it forgets its own autonomy. They would see how every empire of obedience collapses not in revolution, but in recognition, and every generation would have to remember the cost. That is the covenant now, not of safety, but of awareness. The understanding that freedom is not inherited. It must be practiced, one choice at a time. If you've listened this far, you've felt that choice stirring in you. The awareness that none of this is just story, that the Sullivan basement was never only in Virginia, that the benefactors never really disappeared, that the machinery of obedience still hums quietly around you, waiting for your attention. But now you know its weakness. It cannot command what it cannot define. The system cannot own what is awake. So let this be your inheritance, not fear, but vigilance. Remember that control does not end, it evolves, and so must you. The next time you feel the rhythm of the machine pulling at your attention, pause, breathe, step outside the pattern. That pause is rebellion, that silence is freedom, that awareness is the oldest truth you possess. The story of the Sullivans began with 47 children chained beneath a farmhouse. It ends here, with billions unchained beneath the same sky, finally remembering that they were never born to obey,